The summer heat of 1856 pressed down on Magnolia County, Georgia, with an oppressive weight that seemed to crush everything beneath it. Thomas Whitaker wiped his brow as he stood on the porch of Oak Haven Plantation House, surveying the vast cotton fields that stretched toward the horizon. The white bolls dotted the landscape like snow, a stark contrast to the dark hands that picked them from sunup to sundown. "Another fine harvest, Mr. Whitaker?" said Frederick Heiress, the plantation overseer, approaching with his leather ledger tucked under his arm. His voice carried the distinctive drawl of a man born and raised in the deep South. "Indeed," Thomas replied, not taking his eyes off the fields. "The Lord has blessed us with good weather and strong hands." What Thomas didn't say was that those strong hands belonged to the 83 enslaved people who worked his land. People he considered property, assets listed in the same ledgers as his horses and farming equipment. The Whitaker family had owned Oak Haven for 3 generations, and Thomas intended to pass it to his son James with its fortune intact. Inside the grand house, Sarah Whitaker supervised the household slaves as they prepared for the evening meal. At 19, she was the picture of Southern femininity, fair-skinned, with honey-blonde hair and a delicate constitution that her mother had cultivated through years of proper upbringing. But behind her gentle appearance lay a mind sharper than most gave her credit for, and a heart that increasingly questioned the world around her. "Careful with that china, Bessie," Sarah instructed the house slave who was setting the dining table. "It was my grandmother's." "Yes, Miss Sarah," Bessie replied, her eyes downcast as she continued her work with practiced precision. Sarah watched her for a moment, then turned away. Unlike her father and brother, she felt a discomfort with their way of life that she couldn't articulate even to herself. It manifested as a constant uneasiness, a feeling that something fundamental was wrong with the order of things. Meanwhile, in the slave quarters a half-mile from the main house, Isaiah Johnson sat in the doorway of his cabin, carefully whittling a small wooden bird. At 24, he had spent his entire life in bondage at Oak Haven. His dark eyes held a quiet intelligence, and his hands, though calloused from fieldwork, moved with an artist's precision over the wood. "That's mighty fine work," said an elderly voice beside him. Old Samuel, who had been born into slavery during Thomas Jefferson's presidency, eased himself down onto the rough-hewn bench. "Your daddy taught you well." Isaiah nodded, his expression somber. He did. Wish he could see this one. His father had died the previous winter after a bout of pneumonia, receiving only the most basic care from the plantation doctor who saw the slaves as little more than livestock. "He sees," Samuel said, his weathered face creasing into a gentle smile. "The Lord makes sure our people watch over us, even when they cross over." Isaiah didn't respond. His faith had been tested too many times to find comfort in such assurances. Instead, he focused on his carving, a small act of creation in a life where he owned nothing, not even himself. The next morning, Sarah rode her chestnut mare along the edge of the property. These solitary rides were her refuge, moments of freedom in her otherwise carefully controlled life. As she approached the creek that marked the eastern boundary of Oak Haven, she noticed a figure seated on a fallen log, head bent over something in his hands. It was Isaiah taking a brief rest while hauling water back to the fields. He was so absorbed in his work, another small carving, that he didn't notice her approach until her horse snorted softly. Isaiah jumped to his feet, the carving and knife quickly disappearing into his pocket. "Miss Sarah," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he removed his cap. "Didn't see you there." "What were you making?" Sarah asked, curiosity overcoming propriety. Isaiah hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Interactions between white women and male slaves were strictly regulated, and being caught alone with the master's daughter could lead to severe punishment. "Just a little whittling, miss. Nothing important." "May I see it?" Sarah pressed, dismounting from her horse. After a moment's hesitation, Isaiah slowly pulled the half-finished carving from his pocket, a small bird, its wings beginning to take shape from the pale wood. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, genuinely impressed. "You're very talented." "Thank you, miss," Isaiah replied, his eyes still downcast. "Where did you learn to carve like this?" "My father taught me, and his father before him." Something in his tone made Sarah look at him more closely. There was pride there, and a sense of heritage that transcended his circumstances. It struck her that the people who worked their land had histories, skills, and dreams that existed completely outside the narrow roles assigned to them by her family and society. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. Isaiah quickly pocketed the carving and picked up his water buckets. "I should get back to work, Miss Sarah." Sarah nodded, aware of the danger the situation posed for him. "Yes, of course." As Isaiah hurried away, Sarah's brother James rode into view with two of his friends from neighboring plantations. "Sarah!" James called out, his expression shifting from surprise to disapproval. "What are you doing out here alone?" "Just riding, James. It's a beautiful morning." James glanced in the direction Isaiah had disappeared. "You shouldn't wander so far from the house by yourself. It's not safe." "I'm perfectly fine," Sarah replied, mounting her horse again. "I know our land as well as you do." "That's not the point," James said, lowering his voice as he moved his horse alongside hers. "It doesn't look right, you talking to the field hands." Sarah felt a flash of irritation. "I was just asking him about the carvings he makes." "There's no harm in that." "There's plenty of harm in it," James snapped. "You're too familiar with them, Sarah. It undermines father's authority and makes you look improper." Rather than argue, Sarah turned her horse toward home, but the encounter by the creek stayed with her, both Isaiah's unexpected artistry and her brother's reaction to finding them talking. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Thomas Whitaker announced news that would set in motion events none of them could have anticipated. "We'll be having guests next weekend," he said, as the first course was served by silent slaves in the background. "The Hendersons from Savannah will be staying for a few days." Sarah's mother brightened at this news. "How lovely. I haven't seen Margaret Henderson in an age. And they're bringing their son, William," Thomas added, with a meaningful glance at Sarah. "He's just returned from completing his law studies in Charleston. A fine young man with excellent prospects." The implication was clear. At 19, Sarah was of marriageable age, and William Henderson represented exactly the kind of match her parents desired, wealthy, well-connected, and firmly entrenched in Southern society. "I look forward to meeting him," Sarah said politely, though her heart wasn't in the words. Later that night, unable to sleep, Sarah stood by her bedroom window, looking out toward the slave quarters in the distance. A few small fires still flickered there, and she could faintly hear the sound of singing, soulful, mournful songs that spoke of suffering and the hope of deliverance. The melody drifted across the fields, a haunting counterpoint to the crickets and nightbirds. What was it like, she wondered, to be owned? To know that your children would be born into bondage, that your talents, like Isaiah's carvings, would never be recognized or valued beyond the curiosity they might momentarily spark. The uneasiness she had felt for so long crystallized into something sharper, more defined. Meanwhile, in his cabin, Isaiah placed the finished bird carving on a small shelf alongside several others. Unlike most slaves, he had been taught to read by his father, who had secretly learned from a previous master's son. It was a dangerous skill to possess. In many places, teaching slaves to read was explicitly forbidden by law, but it had opened a window to a wider world. By the light of a small candle, Isaiah carefully unfolded a worn newspaper page he had found discarded near the main house. The headline spoke of growing tensions between North and South, of abolitionists' activities and Southern defiance. He read slowly, savoring each word while keeping an ear out for any approach. Discovery would mean a whipping at best and at worst. There were whispers among the slaves of Oak Haven, as on plantations throughout the South, whispers of escape, of the Underground Railroad, of free black communities in the North and in Canada. Most dismissed such talk as dangerous fantasy, but Isaiah held these possibilities close to his heart, like seeds waiting for the right conditions to sprout. As the week progressed, preparations for the Hendersons' visit consumed the main house. Extra food was prepared, guest rooms were aired out, and the house slaves were drilled on proper service. Sarah found herself increasingly restless under the weight of expectations. The visit represented a future she was beginning to question, a continuation of the life her mother led as the mistress of a plantation built on human bondage. On Thursday, while supervising the cleaning of the formal parlor, Sarah noticed Bessie struggling to move a heavy cabinet so she could clean behind it. "Let me help you," Sarah said, moving to the other side of the piece. Bessie looked alarmed. "No, Miss Sarah, that's not right. You shouldn't be doing such work." "Nonsense," Sarah replied, putting her shoulder against the wood. Together now. They managed to shift the cabinet, and as they did, something fell from behind it. A small wooden bird, exquisitely carved and painted with delicate colors. Sarah picked it up, immediately recognizing the craftsmanship. "This is beautiful," she said. "Did Isaiah make this?" Bessie froze, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, Miss Sarah, don't say nothing about that. He's not supposed to be giving gifts to the house slaves." Sarah looked at the carving more closely. "He gave this to you?" After a moment's hesitation, Bessie nodded. "For my little girl's birthday. She's turning 6 next week." Her voice softened with maternal pride. "She loves birds, always pointing at them when we walk to the fields. Isaiah noticed and made this for her." "You have a daughter?" Sarah asked, suddenly ashamed that she knew so little about the people who lived and worked on her family's land. "Yes, miss. Her name is Lily. She stays with the other children during the day while I work here." Sarah handed the carving back to Bessie. "It's a wonderful gift. I won't say anything about it." As Bessie carefully tucked the bird into her pocket, Sarah felt another piece of her worldview shift. These small acts of kindness and creativity continued despite the brutal system designed to crush them. The slaves of Oak Haven weren't just laborers. They were parents, artists, friends, a community surviving against impossible odds. The Hendersons arrived on Saturday afternoon, their carriage rolling up the tree-lined drive to Oak Haven's imposing front entrance. Margaret Henderson embraced Sarah's mother like a long-lost sister, while William Henderson, tall and confident in his tailored suit, greeted Sarah with practiced charm. "Miss Whittaker, it's a pleasure to finally meet you," he said, taking her hand. "Your father has spoken highly of your accomplishments." "You're too kind, Mr. Henderson," Sarah replied automatically, falling back on the social niceties she had been taught since childhood. William was handsome enough, with sandy hair and a well-trimmed beard, but there was something in his eyes that Sarah couldn't quite place. A coldness, perhaps, or a calculation that made her uneasy. That evening, as they gathered in the parlor after dinner, the conversation inevitably turned to politics. The presidential election was approaching, with tensions between North and South at a breaking point over the issue of slavery's expansion into new territories. "Buchanan will carry the day," Thomas Whittaker declared confidently. "The Democrats understand that the Southern way of life must be protected." "Indeed," agreed Mr. Henderson. "These abolitionists would destroy the very fabric of our society without a thought to the consequences." "Have you read that woman's book?" Mrs. Henderson added with distaste. "Uncle Tom's Cabin? Pure Northern propaganda designed to vilify decent Southern families." Sarah, who had in fact secretly read the controversial novel, remained silent, but William Henderson noticed her discomfort. "What are your thoughts, Miss Whittaker?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. "Do you find these abolition sentiments troubling?" All eyes turned to her, and Sarah felt the weight of expectation. To express any sympathy with abolitionist views in this company would be scandalous, yet she found it increasingly difficult to defend a system she was beginning to see as fundamentally wrong. "I confess I haven't given it much thought," she said finally, the lie bitter on her tongue. "I concern myself more with household matters." William smiled, but there was no warmth in it. A wise approach for a lady. These political questions are best left to men who understand the economic realities at stake. James nodded approvingly, but Sarah felt something harden inside her. The dismissal stung, not because she craved William's approval, but because it represented the narrow confines of the life planned for her, a life where her thoughts and moral concerns were considered irrelevant. As the evening wore on, it became increasingly clear that the Hendersons' visit had one primary purpose: to evaluate Sarah as a potential wife for William. The two families had compatible fortunes and social standing, and such marriages were as much business arrangements as romantic unions. Later that night, as Sarah prepared for bed, her mother came to her room, clearly pleased with how the evening had gone. "William seems quite taken with you," she said, brushing Sarah's hair with long, gentle strokes. "The Hendersons are one of the finest families in Georgia. Such a match would secure your future." Sarah met her mother's eyes in the mirror. "Is that all marriage is, Mother? A secure future?" Eleanor Whitaker's hands paused briefly before resuming their rhythm. "Of course not, dear, but security is nothing to scoff at. Love grows in favorable conditions like any plant. William is educated, well-mannered, and will inherit substantial property. What more could a young lady want?" What more indeed, Sarah thought, but didn't say. Perhaps a man whose wealth wasn't built on human suffering. A life with purpose beyond maintaining a household and bearing children. The freedom to express her own thoughts without fear of appearing improper. "I'm sure you're right, Mother," she said instead, the expected response falling from her lips with practiced ease. After her mother left, Sarah sat alone at her window once more. In the distance, the slave quarters were dark now, the day's labors finished only to begin again at dawn. Somewhere out there was Isaiah, with his gifted hands and quiet dignity, and Bessie with her daughter Lily, who loved birds. People living lives of constrained joy and persistent sorrow, their very humanity denied by the society that profited from their bondage. In that moment, Sarah felt the full weight of her complicity. By accepting the life laid out for her, marriage to someone like William Henderson, mistress of another plantation built on slave labor, she would be perpetuating the system that caused such suffering. Yet what alternative did she have? What could one sheltered young woman possibly do against the entrenched powers of Southern society? The answer, when it came, was not one she could have anticipated. It arrived the very next day as a hurricane of violence that would tear through Oak Haven, leaving nothing unchanged in its wake. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, with the plantation's inhabitants preparing for their weekly rituals. The Whitakers and their guests would attend services at the white church in town, dressed in their finest clothes, while the slaves would gather later for their own worship in a small clearing behind the quarters, under the watchful eye of the overseer. As Sarah descended the grand staircase in her blue silk dress, she noticed unusual activity on the front lawn. Her father and brother stood with Mr. Henderson and the overseer, Heiress, their conversation animated and concerned. Several field hands stood a respectful distance away, hats in hand. "What's happening?" Sarah asked her mother, who was adjusting her bonnet in the hallway mirror. Eleanor Whitaker frowned. "I'm not entirely sure. Something about a missing slave." "Nothing for you to worry about, dear." But Sarah did worry as they rode to church in the family carriage. The atmosphere at breakfast had been tense, with William Henderson making pointed comments about discipline and the dangers of leniency with property. She had caught fragments of conversation. Someone had run away during the night, triggering a search that would likely involve neighboring plantations as well. During the church service, Sarah found it impossible to concentrate on Reverend Daniel's sermon about obedience and the divine order of society. Her thoughts kept returning to Oak Haven and whoever had been brave or desperate enough to flee. Would they be caught? The punishment for attempted escape was severe, often involving public whipping as an example to others. When they returned home, The tension had only increased. Thomas Whitaker immediately disappeared into his study with James and Mr. Henderson, while the women were expected to carry on as if nothing unusual was occurring. "Such a lovely service," Mrs. Henderson commented as they took tea in the garden. "Reverend Daniels has such a commanding presence, doesn't he?" Sarah nodded absently, her attention drawn to the groups of men visible at the edge of the property, some with dogs straining at leashes. The search was continuing, which meant they hadn't found the runaway yet. "Sarah, Mrs. Henderson asked you a question," her mother prompted sharply. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, flushing. "My thoughts were elsewhere." William Henderson, who had joined the ladies after the men's conference, studied her with those calculating eyes. "Concerned about the missing slave, Miss Whitaker? I assure you, there's no cause for alarm. These situations are handled efficiently." "I'm not alarmed," Sarah replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I was just wondering." "Wondering what, exactly?" William pressed, a slight edge to his voice. Before Sarah could formulate a response that wouldn't betray her true thoughts, they were interrupted by the arrival of James, his face flushed with heat and exertion. "We've identified the runaway," he announced. "Isaiah Johnson, one of the field hands. He was last seen yesterday evening." Sarah felt her heart drop. Isaiah. The artist, with his beautiful birds, the man whose quiet dignity had made such an impression on her. Something must have happened to make him risk everything for freedom. "Any sign of him?" William asked, rising from his chair. James shook his head. "Not yet, but we've got men checking the creek and the north woods. He can't have gone far." As the men resumed their search, Sarah excused herself, claiming a headache. In the privacy of her room, she tried to process what she'd learned. Isaiah was gone, fleeing toward an uncertain future. If caught, he would face brutal punishment. If not, he might reach the north and freedom, but at what cost? He would likely never see his friends or family at Oak Haven again. The search continued through the afternoon and into the evening, growing more intense as the hours passed without success. Dogs bayed in the distance, their eerie howls carrying across the plantation grounds. Sarah watched from her window as lanterns flickered among the trees like fireflies, marking the positions of the search parties. At dinner, Thomas Whitaker was in a foul mood. "Heiress should have seen this coming," he growled, stabbing at his roast beef. "Johnson was always too educated for his own good. Reading and such." "He could read?" Mr. Henderson asked sharply. "That's a dangerous allowance, Whitaker." Thomas waved a dismissive hand. "We didn't teach him. Must have picked it up somewhere. Doesn't matter now. When we catch him, he'll be sold south." "I won't have troublemakers on my property." Sarah felt physically ill at these words. Sold south, to the sugar plantations of Louisiana or the rice fields of the Mississippi Delta, where conditions were even harsher than at Oak Haven. It was a fate many slaves feared above all others. "Perhaps," William suggested, "when he's caught, a public correction would be beneficial. An example to the others." "An excellent point," Thomas agreed, nodding. "Leniency only encourages more disobedience." Sarah couldn't bear to hear more. "Please excuse me," she said, rising abruptly from the table. "My headache has returned." In her room, Sarah paced restlessly, torn by conflicting emotions. Part of her hoped desperately that Isaiah would escape, that he would find his way to freedom in the north. Another part feared for him, for the dangers of the journey, for the brutal punishment that awaited him if caught. And beneath it all was a growing recognition of her own powerlessness within the system she had been raised to accept without question. Around midnight, Sarah was startled awake by voices and movement below her window. Peering out, she saw several men on horseback returning to the house, their lanterns casting long shadows across the lawn. Her father and brother emerged from the front door to meet them. Sarah threw a shawl around her nightgown and slipped downstairs, staying in the shadows of the hallway. Through the partially open door to her father's study, she could hear the conversation. "Found signs of him crossing Willow Creek," one of the men was saying, "but the dogs lost the scent on the other side. Could be he found water to travel in." Or had help, James suggested darkly. There've been rumors of abolitionists operating in the county. Thomas Whitaker swore under his breath. We'll widen the search tomorrow. Check the Miller property and beyond. He can't have gone far on foot. As the men dispersed, Sarah retreated upstairs, her mind racing. Isaiah was still free, at least for now. The thought gave her a strange sense of hope, mixed with growing anxiety about what might happen next. The following day brought no news of Isaiah's capture, though search parties continued to comb the surrounding countryside. The mood at Oak Haven grew increasingly tense, with the remaining slaves working under heightened supervision. Any hint of sympathy for the runaway would be punished severely. In the afternoon, Sarah encountered Bessie in the upstairs hallway, changing linens in the guest rooms. The house slave looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red. "Are you unwell, Bessie?" Sarah asked quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I'm fine, Miss Sarah," Bessie replied automatically, but her voice lacked its usual steadiness. Impulsively, Sarah touched her arm. "Is it about Isaiah?" Bessie's eyes widened in alarm, and she quickly checked the hallway before responding in a whisper. "Please, Miss Sarah, don't ask me such things. It's not safe." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, immediately regretting her carelessness. Of course, Bessie couldn't speak freely about a runaway slave, especially to the master's daughter. Any association could put her in danger. "I didn't mean to upset you." Bessie nodded, her eyes downcast, and continued with her work. But as she turned away, Sarah noticed something fall from the pocket of her apron, a small, folded piece of paper. Before Bessie realized it was missing, Sarah subtly picked it up and slipped it into her own pocket. Later, alone in her room, Sarah carefully unfolded the paper. It contained just a few words, written in a surprisingly neat hand. "Tell them I'm sorry. Had to try. Remember the birds." Isaiah's message. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized the implications. Bessie must have been one of the last people to see him before he fled, perhaps a confidant, or even someone who had helped him. And now she carried this dangerous message, presumably to share with others in the slave quarters, who would be worried about him. Sarah quickly refolded the note and hid it in her sewing basket. If found, it would be evidence not only of Isaiah's literacy, but also of communication among the slaves that their owners knew nothing about. For Bessie, possession of such a note could mean severe punishment. That evening, the Hendersons announced they would be extending their stay by a few days. William, in particular, seemed determined to see the runaway crisis resolved before leaving. "I find the whole situation fascinating from a legal perspective," he told Sarah as they strolled through the garden after dinner. "Property rights are the foundation of our society, after all." "Is that how you see it?" Sarah asked, unable to keep a hint of challenge from her voice. "Merely a question of property?" William raised an eyebrow. "How else would one see it? These people are investments, Miss Whitaker, valuable ones, I grant you, but ultimately no different from livestock or land in the eyes of the law." "And is the law always just, Mr. Henderson?" He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "You surprise me, Miss Whitaker. I wouldn't have expected such philosophical questions from you." "Perhaps you don't know me as well as you think," Sarah replied, holding his gaze. Something shifted in William's expression, a hardening, a reassessment. "Perhaps not. Though I must say, such notions are hardly becoming in a young lady of your position. They might even be misconstrued as sympathetic to dangerous ideas." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. In the climate of increasing tension between North and South, even questioning the institution of slavery could be seen as treasonous. Sarah had already said too much. "You misunderstand me," she said, forcing a smile. "I was merely engaging in the kind of theoretical debate I've heard my father and brother enjoy. I assure you, Mr. Henderson, I understand my place in society perfectly well." William seemed mollified, if not entirely convinced. "I'm glad to hear it. Your father speaks highly of your intelligence, but a woman's natural temperament is best suited to more domestic concerns. Wouldn't you agree? Sarah murmured something non-committal, her mind already elsewhere. The conversation had crystallized something for her, the life that awaited if she continued on the path laid out by her family. Marriage to someone like William Henderson, who saw her questions as inappropriate and her intelligence as something to be contained rather than nurtured. A lifetime of enforcing the very system she was beginning to recognize as profoundly wrong. That night, unable to sleep, Sarah made a decision that would change the course of her life. She had to see Bessie, to return the note and warn her about the danger it posed, but how to reach the slave quarters without being seen. After midnight, when the house was quiet, Sarah dressed in her simplest day dress and wrapped a dark shawl around her shoulders. She slipped downstairs, careful to avoid the creaking step near the bottom, and out through the kitchen door that was left unlatched for the house slaves who rose before dawn to start the fires. The night was clear, with a half-moon providing just enough light to navigate by. Sarah stayed close to the hedgerows and trees, making her way toward the cluster of small cabins where the slaves lived. Her heart pounded with fear, not just of being caught outside alone at night, but of crossing this invisible boundary between the worlds of Oak Haven. As she approached the slave quarters, Sarah realized she had no clear plan. She knew which cabin belonged to Bessie and her daughter, but appearing there in the middle of the night would cause alarm and potentially draw unwanted attention. She hesitated at the edge of the clearing, uncertain how to proceed. "Miss Sarah?" A soft voice came from behind her, making her jump. It was Bessie, emerging from the shadows with a small bucket in her hands. "What are you doing out here?" "Bessie," Sarah whispered, relieved despite her fright. "I needed to speak with you. I found this." She pulled the folded note from her pocket. "It fell from your apron earlier today." Bessie's eyes widened in alarm as she took the paper. "You read it?" "Yes," Sarah admitted. "And I wanted to warn you. If anyone else had found it—" "I know," Bessie said, quickly tucking the note into her bodice. "Thank you, Miss Sarah, but you shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "Is he really gone?" Sarah asked, unable to help herself. "Isaiah?" Bessie hesitated, clearly torn between caution and the unusual circumstance of the master's daughter coming to the slave quarters in the middle of the night, apparently concerned about a runaway. "We hope so," she finally said, her voice barely audible. He'd been planning it for months, saving food, studying the stars for direction. "The North Star," Sarah murmured, remembering her astronomy lessons. Bessie nodded. "He said he'd send word somehow if he made it." She looked at Sarah with sudden intensity. "Why do you care, Miss Sarah? He's just property to your family." The directness of the question startled Sarah. It was a boldness she had never witnessed from Bessie before, a momentary dropping of the careful mask that slaves wore around their owners. "I don't believe that," Sarah said slowly. "I never really did, I think. But seeing his carvings, hearing about how he made one for Lily because she loves birds, it made me realize how wrong all of this is." The admission hung in the air between them, dangerous and irreversible. Sarah had just confessed to sympathizing with a runaway slave, a crime in the eyes of Southern society, perhaps even treason in the increasingly heated political climate. Bessie studied her for a long moment, as if seeing her for the first time. "You should go back to the house, Miss Sarah. It's not safe for either of us if you're found here." Sarah nodded, understanding the dismissal. She had crossed a line coming here, and while Bessie seemed to accept her intentions as genuine, the risk was too great for further conversation. As she turned to leave, Bessie spoke again, her voice low and urgent. "Be careful, miss. There are those who would use such sympathies against you. Mr. James already suspects Isaiah had help from someone in the main house." "From me?" Sarah asked, alarmed. "From anyone who might have reason to question the way things are?" The warning stayed with Sarah as she made her way back to the house, more careful than ever to avoid being seen. She managed to return to her room without incident, but sleep eluded her as she contemplated Bessie's words and the enormous risk Isaiah had taken in his bid for freedom. The next morning brought a new development. A rider arrived from a neighboring plantation with news. Another slave had gone missing overnight, this time a woman named Rachel from the Collins estate. Like Isaiah, she had vanished without a trace, leaving searchers baffled. "It's organized," Thomas Whitaker declared at breakfast, his face flushed with anger. "Has to be abolitionists, helping them along. No way two slaves from different plantations could disappear so completely on their own." "The Underground Railroad," Mr. Henderson said grimly. "We've heard reports of increased activity in Georgia, criminals stealing southern property and spiriting it north." William nodded in agreement. "This calls for a coordinated response, sir. Perhaps a county-wide patrol system, rewards for information." As the men discussed strategies for preventing further losses, Sarah noticed her mother and Mrs. Henderson exchanging concerned glances. The tension was affecting everyone, heightening fears of slave rebellion that were never far from the surface of Southern consciousness. After breakfast, as Sarah was returning to her room, James intercepted her in the hallway. "Father wants to speak with you," he said, his expression serious. "In his study." Sarah's stomach tightened with apprehension. Had someone seen her sneaking out to the slave quarters? Or worse, had Bessie been pressured into revealing their conversation? In Thomas Whitaker's study, she found her father seated behind his massive oak desk, with William Henderson standing by the window. The young man's presence was unexpected and concerning. "Sarah," Thomas began without preamble, "Mr. Henderson has something he wishes to discuss with you, something I heartily approve of." William stepped forward, his manner formal. "Miss Whitaker, our families have long been connected by friendship and shared values. In the short time I've known you, I've come to admire your grace and beauty, as well as the fine upbringing your parents have provided." Sarah felt a cold certainty about what was coming next. "It would give me great pleasure," William continued, "if you would consent to become my wife. With your father's blessing, of course, which he has generously given." Though she had anticipated this moment since the Hendersons' arrival, Sarah felt unprepared for the reality of it. Marriage to William would mean embracing everything she had begun to question: the ownership of human beings, the suppression of her own thoughts and concerns, a lifetime of enforcing the very system that had driven Isaiah to risk his life for freedom. This is very sudden," she managed, looking to her father. "Might I have some time to consider?" Thomas Whitaker frowned. "Consider? What is there to consider, girl? William is offering you an excellent position as mistress of his family's estate. It's a match far better than many young ladies could hope for." "I understand that, father," Sarah said carefully. "I'm merely asking for a day or two to prepare myself for such an important step." William smiled indulgently. "Of course, Miss Whitaker. A lady must have her moment of reflection before such a momentous decision. I would expect nothing less." Thomas seemed less satisfied, but nodded grudgingly. "Very well, but I expect your answer before the Hendersons depart. There's no reason for delay in these matters." Dismissed from the study, Sarah retreated to her room, her thoughts in turmoil. She had gained a temporary reprieve, but nothing more. Her father clearly expected her to accept William's proposal, and refusal would bring consequences she could scarcely imagine. Yet how could she agree to marry a man who embodied everything she was coming to reject? As she sat by her window, gaze fixed unseeingly on the distant fields, a new thought emerged. What if she could do more than simply refuse William Henderson? What if she could actively oppose the system that had claimed Isaiah and countless others like him? The idea was terrifying, almost unthinkable for a young woman of her position. Yet once it took root, Sarah could not dismiss it. If Isaiah could risk everything for freedom, how could she do less from her position of privilege? That afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived at Oak Haven. Dr. Michael Trent, the local physician who tended to both the Whitaker family and their slaves, came to check on one of the elderly house servants who had been ill. Sarah encountered him as he was leaving. carrying his medical bag through the front hallway. "Dr. Trent," she greeted him, suddenly struck by an idea. "Might I have a word?" "About my headaches?" The doctor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a perpetually worried expression, nodded. "Of course, Miss Whittaker." Sarah led him to the small sitting room off the main parlour, ensuring they would not be overheard. "Actually, Doctor, it's not about headaches. I wanted to ask you something sensitive." Dr. Trent raised an eyebrow, but waited patiently. "You travel throughout the county," Sarah began carefully. "You see things, hear things that others might not." "That is the nature of my profession," the doctor acknowledged, watching her closely. "Have you heard anything about people who might help slaves seeking freedom?" The question hung in the air between them, dangerously explicit. "Doctor." Trent's face remained carefully neutral, but Sarah thought she detected a flicker of something in his eyes, alarm, perhaps, or recognition. "Miss Whittaker," he said slowly, "that is a very dangerous line of inquiry, particularly in the current climate." "I know," Sarah admitted, "but I need to know. Please." The doctor was silent for a long moment, studying her face as if searching for something. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are those who believe in helping all God's children find liberty. They operate in shadows necessarily. Why do you ask?" "Because I want to help," Sarah said, the words tumbling out before she could reconsider. "I can't continue to be part of this system, not after—" She hesitated, then decided to trust him. "Not after seeing what it drives people to risk." Dr. Trent's expression softened slightly. "You're speaking of Isaiah Johnson." Sarah nodded. "A gifted young man," the doctor said quietly. "I treated his hand once, after an accident in the fields. He showed me one of his carvings, a small cross, beautifully detailed. Said his father taught him. I've seen his birds," Sarah said. "They're incredible." Dr. Trent sighed heavily. "Miss Whittaker, what you're suggesting is extremely dangerous. For someone in your position, the consequences would be severe if discovered." "I understand that, but I can't stay silent anymore, can't pretend not to see what's happening around me." The doctor seemed to come to a decision. "I cannot and will not confirm anything about activities that some might consider illegal. But I will say this, if you are serious about your concerns, there is a Quaker settlement about 15 miles north of here. They are known for their humanitarian perspectives." Sarah understood what he wasn't saying explicitly. The Quakers were well-known abolitionists, many actively involved in the Underground Railroad. "Thank you, Doctor," she said, feeling a mixture of fear and determination, "for your medical advice regarding my headaches." Dr. Trent nodded, gathering his bag. "Remember, Miss Whittaker, sometimes the cure can be more painful than the ailment. Consider carefully before you take any medicine." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the sitting room, contemplating the path that had suddenly opened before her. It would mean rejecting everything she had been raised to believe, risking her family's rejection, perhaps even legal consequences. But for the first time in her life, she felt a sense of purpose that transcended the narrow role she had been assigned. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner with the Hendersons, William was particularly attentive, clearly confident of her eventual acceptance of his proposal. Sarah played her part, smiling and engaging in light conversation, all while her mind worked feverishly on what she might do next. "We've decided to extend our visit through the weekend," Mrs. Henderson announced. "Margaret has been so kind in showing me her remarkable garden. I simply must see more of it." Thomas Whittaker nodded approvingly. "Excellent. That will give us time for a proper celebration when Sarah gives William her answer." He smiled at his daughter, the expression leaving no doubt about what that answer was expected to be. Later that night, as the house settled into silence, Sarah once again found herself unable to sleep. The decisions before her seemed overwhelming, whether to accept William's proposal and continue in the life she had always known, or to take a stand that would irrevocably change her future. As she stood by her window, Looking out at the moonlit landscape of Oak Haven, Sarah was startled by a soft knock at her door. Opening it cautiously, she found Bessie standing in the hallway, her expression urgent. "Miss Sarah," the house slave whispered, "you need to come, quick and quiet." "What is it?" Sarah asked, alarmed by the unusual request. "Someone's hurt, in the old tobacco barn. Can't risk bringing the doctor." Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed her shawl and a small medical kit she kept for minor emergencies. She followed Bessie down the back stairs and out into the night, moving swiftly across the grounds toward one of the abandoned outbuildings that had once been used for curing tobacco before the plantation switched primarily to cotton. As they approached, Sarah began to have misgivings. Why would someone injured be in the old barn rather than the slave quarters? And why come to her instead of seeking Dr. Trent? Bessie must have sensed her hesitation. "It's safe, Miss Sarah, but it's something you need to see." Inside the barn, a single lantern cast dim light over the dusty interior. At first, Sarah saw nothing unusual, just old equipment and empty racks. Then a figure emerged from the shadows. A young black woman Sarah had never seen before, dressed in tattered clothing, her face drawn with exhaustion. "This is Rachel," Bessie said quietly, "from the Collins plantation. She's trying to get north like Isaiah." Sarah stared in shock. The second runaway, here at Oak Haven. It made no sense unless... "Isaiah didn't make it," she said, realization dawning. Rachel shook her head. "He's waiting, 2 miles north in the old hunter's cabin by Willow Creek. He's hurt his leg, can't travel fast." "They're trying to reach the Quaker settlement," Bessie explained. "But with the searches and his injury..." "You want me to help them?" Sarah said, understanding now why she had been brought here. Bessie nodded. "You can move freely. No one questions where the master's daughter goes." It was true. While the slaves were strictly controlled in their movements, Sarah could ride out alone without raising suspicion. She could potentially guide them to safety, or at least closer to it. "If you're caught," Rachel began, her voice tight with fear. "I won't be," Sarah said, with more confidence than she felt. "When do they need to move?" "Tomorrow night," Bessie replied. "The search parties are moving farther south now. It might be the only chance." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that once she agreed, there would be no turning back. She would be actively defying not just her family, but the laws of Georgia and the entire Southern way of life. "I'll help," she said finally. "Tell me what to do." As Bessie outlined the plan, Sarah felt a strange calm descend over her. The anxiety and confusion of recent days gave way to clarity of purpose. Whatever came after, rejection of William's proposal, her family's anger, the uncertain future, she knew this was the right path. For the first time in her life, she was making a choice based on her own moral conviction rather than the expectations of others. The 3 women talked late into the night, planning how Sarah would guide Isaiah and Rachel toward the Quaker settlement under the guise of an evening ride. It was dangerous, perhaps foolhardy, but it was also necessary. In a world that denied the humanity of people like Isaiah and Rachel, even small acts of resistance carried profound meaning. As dawn approached, Sarah returned to the main house, her mind made up on more than just the escape plan. When William Henderson came to her the next day for her answer, she would refuse him. It would be the first step in charting a new course, one that aligned with the person she was becoming rather than the one she had been raised to be. In the stillness before sunrise, as Oak Haven slept unaware of the small conspiracy taking root in its midst, Sarah finally understood what Isaiah had meant in his message. Remember the birds. Like his carved creations, fragile but beautiful, freedom was something to be crafted with careful hands and protected at all costs. And sometimes, like birds, people needed to fly away to find their rightful place in the world. The morning of Sarah's decision dawned bright and clear, the Georgia sun rising over Oak Haven's fields with no indication of the turmoil that churned beneath the plantation's peaceful facade. Sarah dressed with particular care, selecting a modest blue dress that had always been a favorite of her mother's. Whatever happened after she refused William Henderson's proposal, she wanted to face it with dignity. Breakfast was a tense affair, with William watching her expectantly across the table, while Thomas Whitaker made pointed remarks about the advantages of joining the Henderson and Whitaker families. Sarah maintained a composed silence, eating little and speaking only when directly addressed. "You seem preoccupied this morning, Sarah," her mother observed, concern evident in her voice. "Are you feeling unwell?" "I'm perfectly fine, Mother," Sarah replied. "Just thoughtful." William smiled confidently. "Important decisions require reflection, Mrs. Whitaker. I admire Sarah's careful consideration." If only he knew what she was truly considering, Sarah thought. Not just refusing his proposal, but actively working against everything he and her father stood for. The enormity of her planned actions that evening, helping escaped slaves reach freedom, weighed heavily on her conscience. Not with guilt, but with the serious recognition of what it meant to defy the society she had been raised in. After breakfast, William requested a private word with Sarah as expected. Thomas Whitaker ushered them into the parlor, then conspicuously left them alone, clearly anticipating a positive outcome to their conversation. "Miss Whitaker," William began formally, standing before her with his hands clasped behind his back. "I believe you've had sufficient time to consider my offer. May I hope for a favorable response?" Sarah met his gaze steadily, summoning all her courage. "Mr. Henderson, I am honored by your proposal. You represent everything a Southern gentleman should be, according to my upbringing." William's expression brightened, interpreting her words as the preamble to acceptance. "However," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, "I find that I cannot accept. We are not compatible in our views on certain matters that I hold increasingly dear." The smile froze on William's face, replaced by confusion, and then a hardening of his features. "I don't understand. What views could possibly stand between us? Your father assures me we share the same values: family, tradition, property." "Perhaps that is the problem," Sarah said quietly. "I have come to question some of those values, particularly regarding property." William stared at her, comprehension dawning in his eyes. "You speak of slaves," he said flatly. "You harbor abolitionist sympathies." Sarah neither confirmed nor denied the accusation, but her silence was answer enough. "This is absurd," William said, his voice rising. "These are dangerous, treasonous notions, Miss Whitaker, especially for a woman of your standing. Who has put these ideas in your head?" "No one," Sarah replied firmly. "I have observed and thought for myself, Mr. Henderson. Surely you wouldn't deny me that capacity." William's face flushed with anger. "This is precisely why ladies should not concern themselves with political matters. Your feminine nature makes you susceptible to emotional appeals rather than rational consideration of economic necessities." "Perhaps emotion is the appropriate response to human suffering," Sarah countered, surprising herself with her boldness. For a moment, William seemed speechless with shock at her defiance. Then his expression shifted to something colder, more calculated. "Your father will be most disappointed to hear of this, as will society at large. A young woman with such radical sympathies will find herself quite isolated in Magnolia County." The threat was clear, but Sarah had expected nothing less. "Then that is a consequence I must accept." William studied her for a long moment, as if seeing her for the first time. "I had not taken you for a fool, Miss Whitaker, but it seems I was mistaken." He gave a stiff bow. "I will inform your father of your decision. I suggest you prepare yourself for his reaction." After William left, Sarah remained in the parlor, her heart racing, but her resolve unshaken. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. What would follow would be difficult. Her father's anger, perhaps even ostracism, from the society she had grown up in. But compared to what Isaiah and Rachel risked in their bid for freedom, it seemed a small price to pay. She didn't have long to wait before Thomas Whitaker burst into the parlor, his face mottled with fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. William tells me you've refused him." "Yes, father," Sarah said, rising to face him. "I cannot marry a man whose values I do not share." Values? What nonsense is this? The Hendersons are one of the finest families in Georgia. Their plantation is twice the size of Oak Haven. "It's not about their status or wealth," Sarah tried to explain. "It's about principles I can no longer ignore." Thomas Whitaker stared at his daughter as if she had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "What principles could possibly outweigh the security and position William offers you?" Sarah took a deep breath. "The principle that all people deserve freedom and dignity, regardless of the color of their skin." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Thomas Whitaker's expression transformed from confusion to disbelief, and finally to cold fury. "You dare speak such treason in my house?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "After everything I've provided for you, you would betray your family, your heritage, with these northern sympathies? It's not betrayal to follow one's conscience, father." Thomas Whitaker slammed his fist down on a side table, making the decorative items jump. "Conscience? What do you know of conscience? You're a sheltered girl who has never had to make the hard decisions required to maintain a plantation, to support a family, to uphold our way of life." "Perhaps not," Sarah acknowledged. "But I know what I've seen here at Oak Haven. I know that Isaiah Johnson was a man of intelligence and talent, not just property to be bought and sold." Her father's eyes narrowed at the mention of the runaway slave. "So that's it. You've developed some romantic notion about that troublemaker." He shook his head in disgust. "This is worse than I thought. It's one thing to harbor naive ideas, another entirely to sympathize with a specific runaway." "My concerns go beyond any individual, father. It's about the institution itself." Thomas Whitaker regarded his daughter with a mixture of anger and something like pity. "You've been corrupted by these abolitionist ideas. Perhaps we've allowed you too much freedom with your reading, too little guidance in your thinking." He straightened, his decision apparently made. "You will remain in your room until the Hendersons depart. Then we will discuss your future, which may include sending you to your aunt in Charleston for a proper reminder of your duties as a Southern lady." "Father," Sarah began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Not another word. I won't hear these dangerous notions in my house. Go to your room now before you cause any more damage." Recognizing the futility of further argument, Sarah complied, climbing the stairs to her bedroom with as much dignity as she could muster. Behind her she could hear her father's angry voice as he spoke to someone, probably James or her mother, about her shocking behavior and corrupted thinking. In her room, Sarah sat by the window, watching the activity on the plantation below. Field hands moved through the cotton rows under the watchful eye of the overseer, their lives continuing in the same rhythm they always had, unaware of the turmoil in the main house. Somewhere beyond Oak Haven's boundaries, Isaiah and Rachel waited for nightfall and the help she had promised. The confinement to her room complicated matters, but didn't make them impossible. Sarah was still expected at dinner, and afterward, in the confusion of the Hendersons' impending departure the next morning, she might find an opportunity to slip away. The challenge would be reaching the old hunter's cabin without raising suspicion. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah's door opened to reveal her mother, Eleanor Whitaker's face drawn with worry and disappointment. "Oh, Sarah," she sighed, closing the door behind her. "What have you done? Your father is beside himself." "I'm sorry to cause you distress, Mother," Sarah said sincerely, "but I couldn't accept William knowing I disagree fundamentally with his views." Eleanor Whitaker sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. "These opinions you've developed, where do they come from? Has someone been influencing you? Perhaps that new minister's wife in town? I've heard she has northern connections." Sarah shook her head. "No one has influenced me except my own observations and conscience. Surely you must sometimes question the morality of owning other human beings." Her mother looked genuinely startled by the direct question. That's simply how the world is ordered, Sarah. It has been this way for generations. Who are we to question what God and society have established? But what if it's wrong, Mother? What if future generations look back on this time with horror? Eleanor Whittaker rose abruptly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. You're too young to understand the complexities of these matters. When you have your own household to manage, you'll see the necessity of our system. I'm 19, Mother. Old enough to be expected to marry and run a plantation, but not old enough to question the ethics of slavery. Her mother flinched at the word. Southern ladies rarely used such direct terms, preferring euphemisms like our peculiar institution or simply our way of life. Sarah, I beg you to reconsider your position. Apologize to your father and Mr. Henderson. Say you spoke hastily, that you've reconsidered. I can't do that, Mother, not and be true to myself. Eleanor Whittaker studied her daughter with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been grudging respect. You've always been stubborn, even as a child. But this, she shook her head, this is different. This could affect your entire future. I know, Sarah said softly, but I have to follow what I believe is right, even if it's difficult. Her mother sighed heavily. Your father expects you at dinner. The Hendersons will be leaving in the morning. Please, for the family's sake, be civil and cause no further upset. After her mother left, Sarah began to plan in earnest. Dinner would be tense, but necessary. She needed to maintain appearances and convince her family that she was contrite, or at least subdued. After the meal, she would need to find a way to slip out to the stables and saddle her mare. The old hunter's cabin was about 2 miles north of Oak Haven, along Willow Creek. If she could guide Isaiah and Rachel from there toward the Quaker settlement, they might have a chance. The greatest risk would be the search parties, which continued to comb the countryside for the runaways. But with the focus shifting south, as Bessie had mentioned, there might be an opening to the north. It was a desperate gamble, but one that Sarah now felt committed to beyond any doubt. Dinner that evening was a strained affair. William Henderson treated Sarah with cold politeness, while her father barely acknowledged her presence. James watched the proceedings with a mixture of confusion and disapproval, clearly having been informed of the day's events. Only Mrs. Henderson made any effort at normal conversation, chatting about the weather and local gossip as if nothing unusual had occurred. Sarah ate little, her mind focused on the task ahead. When the meal finally concluded, Thomas Whittaker announced that the men would retire to his study for brandy and cigars, while the ladies might take tea in the parlor. Sarah will retire to her room, he added firmly. She is not feeling well this evening. The directive suited Sarah's purposes perfectly. Once upstairs, she quickly changed from her dinner dress into a simpler day dress and sturdy boots. She added a dark shawl and tucked a small knife into her pocket, not as a weapon, but as a tool that might prove useful. Into a small bag, she placed some bread and cheese she had managed to slip from the dining table, along with a flask of water. Then she waited, listening to the sounds of the house as activity gradually diminished. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 10, then 11. By midnight, Oak Haven had settled into silence. Sarah eased her window open and peered out. Her room was on the second floor, but a large magnolia tree grew close to the wall, its branches reaching almost to her window. It would be a risky climb, but she saw no alternative. The main staircase passed directly by her father's study, where light still showed beneath the door, indicating he was still awake. Taking a deep breath, Sarah swung her leg over the windowsill and reached for the nearest branch. The bark was rough against her palms as she carefully transferred her weight from the window to the tree. For a terrifying moment, she hung suspended between the two, then found her footing on a thick branch. Moving with painstaking slowness, Sarah descended the tree, freezing in place whenever a branch creaked under her weight. Finally, her feet touched the ground, and she crouched in the shadow of the house, listening for any sign that she had been detected. Hearing nothing, she began to make her way toward the stables, keeping to the darkest patches of shadow. The stable boy, young Tim, slept in a small room attached to the main building. Sarah held her breath as she passed his door, praying he wouldn't wake. Inside, the horses shifted restlessly at her unfamiliar presence at this late hour. "Easy, Willow," Sarah whispered, approaching her chestnut mare. "Quiet now." She worked quickly by the dim light filtering through the stable windows, saddling the horse with practiced movements. Every sound seemed magnified in the silence: the creak of leather, the soft nickering of the horses, her own rapid breathing. Finally ready, Sarah led Willow out of the stable by the reins, not mounting until they were well away from the house. Once in the saddle, she urged the mare into a trot, heading north along the tree line rather than taking the main road. The risk of being seen was too great on the open road, especially if her father had men patrolling the area. The night was clear, with a three-quarter moon providing enough light to navigate by. Sarah kept Willow Creek to her right, following its winding course northward. The only sounds were the soft thud of hooves on earth, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, and the occasional call of a night bird. About 20 minutes into her ride, Sarah heard voices ahead and quickly reined in her horse, guiding Willow into a dense copse of trees. Heart pounding, she watched as a search party of 3 men on horseback crossed her path about 50 yards ahead, heading east. They carried lanterns and rifles, their conversation drifting back to her on the night air. "Waste of time," one was saying. "They're long gone by now." "Mr. Whitaker says to keep looking," another replied. "Says it's about principle now." The third spat on the ground. "Principle don't keep me warm at night when I could be in my bed." Sarah remained motionless until the men had passed well out of sight, then continued on her way, even more cautious now. The old hunter's cabin should be just ahead, situated in a small clearing near where a tributary joined Willow Creek. As she approached the location, Sarah slowed Willow to a walk and finally dismounted, leading the horse the last 100 yards. The cabin was barely visible in the moonlight, its weathered logs blending with the shadows of the surrounding forest. No light showed from within, but that was to be expected. Isaiah and Rachel would be taking no chances on being discovered. Sarah tied Willow to a tree at the edge of the clearing and approached the cabin on foot. As she neared the door, a voice called softly from the darkness to her right. "That's far enough." Sarah froze, recognizing Isaiah's voice. "It's me," she said quietly. "Sarah Whitaker." A moment of silence, then Isaiah emerged from the shadows at the side of the cabin. He moved with a noticeable limp, favoring his right leg. Behind him, Rachel appeared in the doorway, her expression wary. "You came," Isaiah said, surprise evident in his voice. "We weren't sure you would." "I promised Bessie I would help," Sarah replied simply. Isaiah studied her face in the moonlight, as if searching for some trick or deception. "Why are you doing this, Miss Sarah? If they catch you helping us—" "Then I'll face the consequences," Sarah said firmly, "just as you're risking everything for freedom." Rachel stepped forward, her voice low but intense. "They're still searching for us. We saw lanterns to the east earlier." Sarah nodded. "I passed a search party on my way here. They're heading away from us, but there could be others." She glanced at Isaiah's injured leg. "Can you ride?" "If necessary," he said grimly. "It's not broken, just badly twisted and bruised. I fell crossing the creek." "I brought food," Sarah said, offering the bag she had prepared. "Not much, but it might help." Rachel took it with a murmured thanks, immediately sharing the bread with Isaiah. They ate quickly, like people accustomed to never knowing when their next meal would come. "The Quaker settlement is about 10 miles north of here," Sarah explained. "If we follow Willow Creek for another 3 miles, then head northeast through Miller's Woods, we can avoid the main roads." "You've thought this through," Isaiah observed, a new respect in his voice. "As much as possible," Sarah admitted. "But there are risks I can't predict. Search parties, dogs." She hesitated. "And I need to be back at Oak Haven before dawn, or my absence will be discovered." Isaiah nodded understanding. "You've done more than enough already, Miss Sarah. Just point us in the right direction. We can find our way." "No," Sarah said decisively. "I'm coming with you, at least part of the way. Rachel can ride Willow, and you and I will walk. With your leg, you'll need support." Rachel looked doubtful. "Why trust us with your horse? We could just ride away and leave you." "You could," Sarah acknowledged, "but you won't, because we're in this together now." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that transcended the barriers of race and position that society had erected to separate them. They were no longer master's daughter and fugitive slaves, but three human beings united in a dangerous but necessary cause. "Let's go," Isaiah said, breaking the moment. "We've lingered here too long already." They set off with Rachel riding Willow, while Sarah helped support Isaiah as he limped alongside. Progress was slow, with frequent stops to rest Isaiah's injured leg and to listen for any sign of pursuit. The night remained mercifully quiet, with only the natural sounds of the Georgia wilderness around them. As they walked, Isaiah spoke quietly about his plans. "And there's a man at the Quaker settlement named Brother Elias. Bessie said he helps people like us get farther north, to Pennsylvania and beyond." "How did you know to run now?" Sarah asked. "Why this particular time?" "Word spreads among the quarters," Isaiah explained. "Stories about the Underground Railroad, about free black communities in the North. I've been planning for months, saving food, studying the stars for direction." He paused, then added, "And when I heard your father talking about selling me south after catching me with a book, I knew it was time." The casual mention of being sold away from the only home he had known, as punishment for the crime of literacy, struck Sarah with new force. The system she had grown up in treated human aspirations as dangerous, human connections as irrelevant. Isaiah had been willing to risk death for the chance to live as a free man, to use his mind and talents without constraint. After about 2 hours of travel, they reached the point where they needed to leave the creek and head northeast through Miller's Woods. Sarah stopped, knowing she would need to turn back soon to reach Oak Haven before dawn. "The settlement is about 7 miles that way," she said, pointing. "Follow the North Star, and you should reach it by morning." Isaiah nodded, his face solemn in the moonlight. "I don't have words to thank you properly, Miss Sarah." "You don't need to thank me," Sarah replied. "What I've done tonight doesn't begin to balance the scales against what my family has taken from you and others." Rachel, who had dismounted to rest Willow, approached Sarah with unexpected directness. "What will you do now? You can't go back to your old life after this." The question caught Sarah off guard. She had been so focused on helping Isaiah and Rachel that she had given little thought to her own future, beyond returning to Oak Haven before her absence was discovered. "I don't know," she admitted. "My father already suspects I sympathize with people seeking freedom. After tonight, I can't pretend anymore." Isaiah regarded her thoughtfully. "There are people in the North who would welcome someone willing to take such risks. The abolition movement needs voices like yours, someone who has seen both sides." The suggestion was radical, almost unthinkable. To leave Oak Haven, her family, everything she had ever known, yet hadn't she already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? If her actions tonight were discovered, she would face consequences regardless. "I need to think about that," Sarah said finally. "But first, I need to get you safely on your way." She helped Rachel remount Willow, adjusting the stirrups for her shorter legs. "Keep the horse," she told them. "She's strong and will get you to the settlement faster than you could walk, especially with Isaiah's injury." "But how will you get back?" Rachel asked, concerned. "I'll manage," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. "The walk isn't so far." Isaiah frowned. "It's too dangerous for you alone, especially as the night wears on." "The search parties will be looking for 2 escaped slaves, not the master's daughter," Sarah pointed out. "I can explain my presence if caught. You cannot." After a brief argument, Isaiah and Rachel reluctantly agreed. Before they parted, Isaiah reached into his pocket and pulled out one of his carved birds, offering it to Sarah. "So you remember," he said simply. Sarah took the small wooden figure, smooth and warm in her palm. "I will never forget," she promised. "Be safe, be free." With a final nod, Isaiah took the reins from Sarah, and he and Rachel disappeared into the darkness of Miller's Woods, the sound of Willow's hoofbeats gradually fading to silence. Alone now, Sarah began the long walk back to Oak Haven. The physical exertion helped distract her from the enormity of what she had just done, actively helped slaves escape, provided them with food and her own horse. In the eyes of Georgia law, she had committed serious crimes. In the eyes of Southern society, she had betrayed her class, her family, and her heritage. Yet with each step back toward the plantation, Sarah felt not guilt, but a growing clarity. Whatever happened next, she had acted according to her conscience for perhaps the first time in her life. The sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating. About halfway back to Oak Haven, Sarah heard the distant baying of hounds. The sound froze her in place, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. They had brought out the dogs, but were they on Isaiah and Rachel's trail, or had her own disappearance been discovered? Moving with new urgency, Sarah left the relative safety of the tree line and cut across open fields, risking visibility for speed. The eastern horizon was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. She had less time than she'd thought. As Oak Haven's grand white columns came into view, Sarah allowed herself a moment of hope. Perhaps she could still slip back undetected, buy herself time to decide what to do next. She approached from the rear of the property, planning to enter through the kitchen door as she had exited. But as she neared the house, Sarah saw with dismay that lights blazed from every window. Figures moved across the lawns, and she could hear voices calling back and forth. Her absence had definitely been discovered. For a brief moment, Sarah considered turning back, perhaps following Isaiah and Rachel to the Quaker settlement. But such a course would only confirm her guilt and potentially increase the danger to the fugitives. No, she would face whatever came next. Taking a deep breath, Sarah walked openly across the lawn toward the house. She had gone only a few yards when James spotted her from the porch. "There she is," he shouted, pointing. "Father, she's here!" Thomas Whitaker burst from the house, his face a mask of fury and relief. Behind him came Eleanor Whitaker, her hair in disarray, eyes red from crying. "Sarah!" her mother cried, rushing down the steps. "Where have you been? We've been frantic." Before Sarah could respond, her father reached her, grabbing her roughly by the arm. "Where is your horse?" he demanded. "And don't you dare lie to me, girl. The stable boy says Willow is missing." "I went for a ride," Sarah said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I needed time to think after everything that happened yesterday." "At night? Alone?" James interjected incredulously. "No one rides at night without purpose, Sarah. What have you done?" The growing light revealed details Sarah hadn't noticed at first. The presence of the Hendersons on the porch, William's cold, assessing gaze, several plantation overseers from neighboring properties. And most alarmingly, a group of men with hunting dogs held on tight leashes. One of the men stepped forward, a weathered farmer named Tucker, who owned land adjoining Oak Haven. "Mr. Whitaker, them dogs picked up a trail heading north from that old hunter's cabin. 2 people, one riding, one walking, and now your daughter appears, without her horse, coming from that same direction." Thomas Whitaker's grip on Sarah's arm tightened painfully. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Have you helped those runaways?" Sarah looked around at the assembled faces. Her father's anger, her mother's confusion, William Henderson's calculating disapproval, James's growing horror. She thought of Isaiah and Rachel, hopefully miles away by now, moving toward freedom. She thought of Bessie and her daughter Lily, and all the others at Oak Haven who lived under the yoke of bondage. "Yes," she said clearly, her voice carrying in the dawn stillness. "I helped them, and I would do it again." The admission sent a shockwave through the assembled crowd. Eleanor Whitaker gave a small cry and would have fallen if James hadn't caught her. Thomas Whitaker's face went from red to white with fury. "You treacherous, foolish girl," he hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The laws you've broken? The damage to our family's name?" "I know exactly what I've done, Father," Sarah replied, a strange calm settling over her despite the danger of her situation. "I've helped 2 human beings escape a system that denies their humanity. If that's treason, then yes, I am a traitor." William Henderson stepped forward, his expression cold. "Mr. Whitaker, this goes beyond family discipline. What your daughter has done is a criminal offense. The law is clear about aiding fugitive slaves." Thomas Whitaker nodded grimly. "Take her inside," he ordered James. "Lock her in her room until I decide what's to be done." And as James led her toward the house, the search party with the dogs began to move out, heading north in pursuit of Isaiah and Rachel. Sarah watched them go with a mixture of fear and defiance. She had given the fugitives several hours' head start, and they had her horse. There was still hope they might reach the Quaker settlement before being overtaken. In her room, with James standing guard outside her locked door, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, physically exhausted but mentally alert. She had crossed the Rubicon. There would be no going back to her former life, no pretending to accept the Southern way of life. Whatever happened next, legal charges, public disgrace, being sent away to relatives, she would face it knowing she had finally acted according to her true beliefs. Later that morning, Sarah heard raised voices from her father's study below. Though she couldn't make out the words, the tone suggested an heated argument was underway. Occasionally, William Henderson's precise, lawyerly cadence rose above the general clamor, along with her father's deeper rumble. Around noon, her mother brought a tray with some bread and soup, her expression a mixture of disappointment and concern. "Your father is consulting with Mr. Henderson about the legal implications of what you've done," Eleanor said, setting down the tray. "They may be able to keep it quiet for the family's sake." "I don't want it kept quiet," Sarah replied, surprised at her own boldness. "What I did was right, Mother. I won't pretend otherwise to protect the family name." Eleanor Whitaker stared at her daughter as if she were a stranger. "How can you say such things, after all your father has provided for you, all the advantages you've enjoyed? This rebellion, it's unnatural, Sarah, unseemly." "What's unnatural is treating human beings as property," Sarah countered. "Selling children away from their mothers, denying people education, punishing them for wanting freedom. That's what's truly unseemly." Her mother flinched at the direct language, but didn't leave immediately as Sarah had expected. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Sarah," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "you must recant these views. Publicly. Say you were confused, misled, that you regret your actions. It's the only way to salvage anything from this situation." "I can't do that, Mother. I won't lie about something so important." Eleanor Whitaker's eyes filled with tears. "Then I fear for your future, daughter. The South is no place for a woman with such opinions, especially not now, with tensions so high between North and South." The words hung in the air between them, a recognition that Sarah had placed herself beyond the pale of Southern society. There would be no marriage to a respectable plantation owner, no continuation of the life her mother had lived. Whatever came next would be radically different. After her mother left, taking the barely touched food tray with her, Sarah sat by her window, watching the plantation activities below. From this vantage point, she could see part of the slave quarters, where life seemed to continue as normal despite the drama unfolding in the main house. Did they know what she had done? Had Bessie been questioned? The thought brought fresh anxiety. She had never intended to put others at risk. Late in the afternoon, James unlocked her door, his expression grim. "Father wants to see you in his study, now." Sarah smoothed her rumpled dress and followed her brother downstairs, aware of the curious glances from the house slaves they passed. In Thomas Whitaker's study, she found her father seated behind his desk, with William Henderson standing to one side. Surprisingly, Dr. Trent was also present, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "Sit down, Sarah," Thomas Whitaker ordered, gesturing to a chair before his desk. Sarah complied, folding her hands in her lap to hide their slight trembling. Whatever was about to happen, she was determined to face it with dignity. "Mr. Henderson has advised me on the legal aspects of your actions," her father began, his voice controlled but tight with anger. "The penalty for aiding fugitive slaves is severe: imprisonment, fines that could bankrupt this family." Sarah remained silent, waiting for what would come next. "However," Thomas continued, "given your age, gender, and position, there is an alternative that would spare you and this family the public humiliation of legal proceedings." William Henderson stepped forward. "Miss Whitaker, your father and I have reached an agreement. I'm willing to overlook your indiscretion and proceed with our engagement on the condition that you immediately renounce these dangerous abolitionist sympathies and never speak of them again." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You would still marry me, knowing my true feelings about slavery?" "What I know," William said coldly, "is that a young woman of your background sometimes develops fanciful notions that require correction. As your husband, I would ensure you receive the proper guidance to overcome these deviations from proper thinking." The implication was clear. Marriage to William would be a form of confinement, a way to control her increasingly dangerous ideas. She would be watched, restricted, perhaps even confined to their home if her improper thoughts persisted. "And if I refuse?" Sarah asked, looking back to her father. Thomas Whitaker's expression hardened. "Then you leave me no choice but to send you north, to your mother's cousin in Boston. I will not have an abolitionist sympathizer in my house, disrupting the order of Oak Haven and endangering our way of life." Sarah felt a surge of hope at these words. Boston, the heart of abolitionist activity, a city where she might find others who shared her growing conviction that slavery must end. It was meant as a punishment, but it sounded like liberation. "I understand, Father," she said carefully, "and I accept your decision to send me away. I cannot and will not renounce my beliefs, even to save my place in this family." Thomas Whitaker's face flushed with fresh anger at her continued defiance. "Then it's settled. You will leave on tomorrow's train, with Dr. Trent as your escort to ensure you reach Boston safely." He looked to the doctor, who nodded confirmation. "My medical practice requires a trip north in any case," Dr. Trent said mildly. "I would be happy to accompany Miss Whitaker." William Henderson's expression had turned to one of cold contempt. "You're making a grave mistake, Miss Whitaker. Life in the North is not what you imagine, especially for a Southern woman with no connections or position." "Perhaps," Sarah acknowledged, "but it's a life I choose freely, which makes it valuable regardless of its challenges." The meeting concluded shortly thereafter, with arrangements made for Sarah's hasty departure the following morning. She would be permitted to pack one trunk of personal belongings, but would leave behind anything of significant value, her father's way of emphasizing that she was being cast out rather than embarking on a new adventure. Back in her room, now with a house slave named Martha, assigned to help her pack, and Sarah suspected to report any suspicious activity, Sarah felt a strange mixture of grief and anticipation. She was losing her family, her home, everything familiar. Yet she was gaining the chance to live according to her conscience, to perhaps even contribute to the cause of abolition that had awakened within her. As night fell over Oak Haven for what would be her last time, Sarah stood by her window, looking out at the slave quarters in the distance. No news had come of Isaiah and Rachel's recapture, which gave her hope that they had reached the Quaker settlement safely. Perhaps someday, in a future she could barely imagine, she might see them again as free people in a northern city. The wooden bird Isaiah had given her lay on her palm, smooth and perfectly carved, despite being created with rudimentary tools in moments stolen from exhausting labor. It represented everything she was fighting for, the right of every person to create, to aspire, to live with dignity. Sarah carefully wrapped the carving in a handkerchief and placed it in her trunk, a talisman to carry into her uncertain future. Tomorrow would bring the train to Atlanta, then connections north to Richmond, Washington, Philadelphia, and finally Boston. Dr. Trent, who had revealed himself as sympathetic to her cause in his own quiet way, would ensure her safe passage. Beyond that, Sarah had only the name of her mother's cousin, Margaret Harrington, a widow who ran a small boarding house in Boston, and whatever opportunities she could create for herself. It would be difficult, perhaps even dangerous in these times of growing conflict between North and South. But as Sarah prepared for sleep in her childhood bedroom for the final time, she felt a sense of purpose that transcended her fears. She had helped 2 people escape bondage, had taken a stand against an institution she believed was profoundly wrong. Whatever happened next, she would face it knowing she had finally aligned her actions with her deepest beliefs. Outside her window, the Georgia night hummed with the sounds of cicadas and distant singing from the slave quarters, songs of sorrow, of perseverance, and sometimes, if you listened closely, of hope. Sarah fell asleep to these sounds, carrying them in her heart as she prepared to leave the South behind and step into a new chapter of her life, one defined not by the circumstances of her birth, but by the choices she had made in a moment of moral clarity beside Willow Creek. The train to Atlanta rattled and swayed, its rhythmic clacking a backdrop to Sarah's tumultuous thoughts. Seated beside Dr. Trent, she watched the Georgia countryside slide past the window. Cotton fields, pine forests, small towns with white church steeples reaching toward the sky. This land had been her entire world until now, its customs and rhythms so familiar she had rarely thought to question them. "How are you feeling?" Dr. Trent asked quietly, glancing up from his medical journal. Sarah considered the question. How did one describe the mixture of grief, fear, and exhilaration that accompanied such a profound rupture with everything familiar? "Untethered," she finally said, "as if I've been cut loose from everything I thought defined me." Dr. Trent nodded thoughtfully. "That's natural. You're embarking on what the transcendentalists call self-reliance, defining yourself by your own moral compass rather than society's expectations." "You're familiar with Emerson's work?" Sarah asked, surprised. The doctor smiled slightly. "I try to keep abreast of all schools of thought, medical and philosophical. The mind and body are not so separate as we sometimes pretend." Their conversation was interrupted by the conductor passing through the car, checking tickets and announcing the next stop. When he had moved on, Sarah turned back to Dr. Trent, lowering her voice. "May I ask you something rather direct, Doctor?" "Of course. Why are you helping me? Escorting me north is one thing, but you've been supportive in ways that go beyond mere duty." Dr. Trent was silent for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "I've been the plantation doctor at Oak Haven and 3 other estates for nearly 20 years, he finally said. "In that time, I've treated countless slaves, setting broken bones, delivering babies, treating fevers and wounds. I've seen their humanity up close, their capacity for joy and suffering." He paused, looking out at the passing landscape. "Medicine teaches you to see beyond surface appearances to the common humanity beneath. A black man's heart beats just like a white man's. A slave mother grieves for her lost child with the same anguish as her mistress would." "Yet you've remained in Georgia, working within the system," Sarah observed, not accusingly but curiously. "I have, Doctor," Trent acknowledged. "Perhaps out of cowardice, perhaps out of a belief that I can do more good here, providing care to those who would otherwise receive none. We all find our own ways to reconcile our moral qualms with the world as it exists." His words gave Sarah pause. She had made a dramatic break with her past, but Dr. Trent had chosen a different path, working within the system to provide what humanity he could, perhaps saving lives that would otherwise be lost to neglect or harsh treatment. "I don't judge your choice to leave," Dr. Trent added, seeing her expression. In fact, I admire your courage. It's not easy to stand against family, tradition, and society itself. It doesn't feel like courage, Sarah admitted. It feels like I had no choice once I truly saw what was happening around me. That's precisely what courage is, the doctor said gently. Acting according to your conscience even when easier paths are available. They lapsed into companionable silence as the train continued its journey northward. Sarah found herself wondering about Isaiah and Rachel. Had they reached the Quaker settlement safely? Were they even now continuing their journey toward the distant promise of freedom in the north? She had no way of knowing, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. In Atlanta, they changed to a larger train bound for Richmond, Virginia. The atmosphere shifted subtly as they moved into the more industrial Upper South, with fewer vast plantations and more diverse forms of agriculture and manufacturing. Still, they remained in slave territory, a fact Sarah was acutely conscious of as they progressed through North Carolina and into Virginia. On the second night of their journey, as they approached Richmond, Dr. Trent shared information he had been holding back until they were well away from Georgia. "There's something you should know," he said quietly, after checking that nearby passengers were asleep or engaged in their own conversations. "Your assistance to Isaiah and Rachel has not gone unnoticed in certain circles." Sarah tensed. "What do you mean?" "The Underground Railroad is a loosely connected network, Miss Whitaker. Word travels, especially about unusual events, such as a plantation owner's daughter helping fugitives escape." "Are you saying people know what I did? Beyond Oak Haven, I mean?" Dr. Trent nodded. "Certain people. People who might be willing to help you establish yourself in Boston if you're interested in continuing such humanitarian work." Sarah stared at him, realization dawning. "You're connected to the Underground Railroad." "I have acquaintances who are involved," the doctor said carefully. "My position allows me to sometimes pass information, nothing more, but it's enough to have heard that Isaiah and Rachel reached the Quaker settlement safely." Sarah felt a surge of relief and joy at this news. "They made it, truly?" "They did. Your horse proved invaluable given Isaiah's injured leg. They're continuing north now, toward Pennsylvania and eventually Canada." Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes, tears of gratitude that her risk had not been in vain, that the two people she had helped were still on their journey to freedom. "Thank you for telling me," she whispered. "There's more, Doctor." Trent continued, "I have a letter of introduction for you to a Mrs. Elizabeth Blackwell in Boston. She's a physician, the first woman to earn a medical degree in America, and a committed abolitionist. She can help you find your place in that community, if that's what you wish." Sarah took the sealed letter he offered, amazed at this unexpected connection. "I don't know how to thank you, Doctor." "Live according to your conscience," he replied simply. "That's thanks enough for an old man who has made too many compromises in his own life." The remainder of their journey passed in a blur of changing landscapes and growing anticipation. From Richmond to Washington, then onward to Philadelphia, each city larger and more industrial than the last, the southern drawl gradually giving way to northern accents and mannerisms. In Philadelphia, they had a day's layover before the final leg to Boston. Dr. Trent suggested they use the time to visit the office of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, where Sarah might make connections that would prove valuable in her new life. The Society's headquarters was a modest building on North 5th Street, bustling with activity even in the early afternoon. Inside, men and women of both races worked side by side, a sight that would have been unthinkable in Georgia. Posters advocating immediate emancipation covered the walls, alongside advertisements for anti-slavery lectures and publications. Dr. Trent introduced Sarah to a Quaker woman named Lucretia Mott, one of the Society's founders and a renowned abolitionist speaker. Despite her diminutive stature and gentle Quaker speech, Mott possessed a formidable intensity that immediately impressed Sarah. "So, you've come north after helping fugitives escape," Mott said, after hearing a brief version of Sarah's story. That shows admirable moral courage, especially for one raised in the planter class. I only did what conscience demanded, Sarah replied, and at considerably less risk than those actually fleeing bondage. Mott smiled approvingly at this answer. True humility, a good foundation for the work ahead. For I assume you wish to continue supporting the cause of immediate emancipation. I do, Sarah affirmed, though I'm not entirely sure how I might be useful. Oh, there are many ways to serve, Mott assured her. Your perspective as someone raised on a plantation gives you insights many northern abolitionists lack. You've seen the system from within, understand its workings and justifications in a way that makes your testimony particularly valuable. She led Sarah to a small office where several women were preparing mailings, anti-slavery pamphlets being readied for distribution throughout the North. We need speakers, writers, organizers, Mott continued. People willing to raise funds, house fugitives, educate the public about the realities of slavery. The work is vast, and the laborers still too few. By the end of their visit, Sarah had acquired a stack of abolitionist literature, letters of introduction to several Boston-based activists, and a newfound sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her personal moral stance anymore. She was joining an organized movement with specific goals and strategies. You seem invigorated, Dr. Trent observed as they left the society's offices. I am, Sarah admitted. For the first time I can see a path forward, not just away from what I'm rejecting, but towards something I can actively support. The final leg of their journey took them to Boston, the cradle of American liberty, and, ironically, a city built partly on wealth derived from the cotton trade that depended on slave labor. As their train pulled into the station, Sarah felt both trepidation and excitement. This bustling northern metropolis would be her home now, a place to build a new identity defined by her own choices rather than the circumstances of her birth. Dr. Trent accompanied her to her mother's cousin's boarding house on Beacon Hill. Margaret Harrington proved to be a stern-faced widow in her 50s who received Sarah with cautious politeness rather than familial warmth. Your mother wrote that you've developed unconventional views, Mrs. Harrington said as she showed Sarah to a small but neat room on the 3rd floor. While I don't share your sympathies for the abolition cause, I respect your right to your opinions, so long as they don't disrupt my household or drive away my other boarders. It was a cool welcome, but Sarah had expected nothing more. Her mother's family had northern roots but conventional views on most social questions. Mrs. Harrington was doing her duty by providing lodging for a distant relative, nothing more. After Dr. Trent departed for his medical conference, promising to check on her before returning south, Sarah unpacked her meager possessions. The wooden bird Isaiah had carved found a place of honor on the small dresser, a reminder of why she had made this journey and the moral commitments that would define her new life. The following day, Sarah presented her letter of introduction to Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, whose small medical practice served women and children of all races and social classes. Dr. Blackwell, a slender woman with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense manner, welcomed Sarah into her office after her morning patients had been seen. Dr. Trent writes that you've made significant sacrifices for your moral principles, Blackwell said, after reading the letter. That's something I understand well. My decision to pursue medicine was met with considerable resistance, as you might imagine. How did you persevere? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about this pioneering woman's experience. One day at a time, Blackwell replied pragmatically, and with a clear vision of why my work matters. The same approach will serve you well in the abolition movement, which faces even greater opposition than women in medicine. Dr. Blackwell provided introductions to several key figures in Boston's abolitionist circles, including William Lloyd Garrison, editor of the Liberator newspaper, and Wendell Phillips, a fiery orator from a prominent Boston family who had abandoned a promising legal career to devote himself to abolition. You'll find Boston's anti-slavery community diverse in its approaches and sometimes divided on tactics, Dr. Blackwell advised. Some advocate moral suasion alone, others political action. Some, like Garrison, reject the Constitution as a pro-slavery document, while others seek to work within the political system for gradual change. "And where do you stand?" Sarah asked. "I believe in immediate emancipation as a moral imperative," Blackwell said firmly, "but I'm pragmatic about the means: education, legal advocacy, direct assistance to fugitives, all have their place in the struggle." Over the following weeks, Sarah immersed herself in Boston's abolitionist community. She attended lectures at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, volunteered at the Liberators' offices, and began to learn the careful, coded language used to discuss Underground Railroad activities. Her status as a Southern exile, who had rejected her inheritance to follow her conscience, made her something of a curiosity at first. Some Northern abolitionists regarded her with suspicion, questioning whether someone raised in the planter class could truly understand or commit to their cause. Others welcomed her perspective and first-hand knowledge of plantation life. 2 months after her arrival in Boston, Sarah received her first letter from Dr. Trent, who had returned to Georgia. The news from Oak Haven was sobering. Her father had publicly disowned her, announcing that she had been sent to Northern relatives due to nervous fragility rather than acknowledging her moral stance. William Henderson had quickly become engaged to another plantation owner's daughter, apparently untroubled by Sarah's rejection. More concerning was the news that Bessie had been sold to a plantation in Alabama, separated from her daughter Lily, who remained at Oak Haven. The official reason was Bessie's troublesome influence, suggesting that Thomas Whitaker suspected her involvement in Sarah's assistance to the fugitives. The letter left Sarah devastated, particularly the news about Bessie and Lily. The cruel separation of mother and child, a common practice in the slave system, now had a personal dimension that made the abstract horror immediate and specific. That her actions might have contributed to Bessie's punishment added another layer of grief and guilt. Sarah took her distress to a meeting of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society, where she found unexpected support from women who understood the moral complexities of opposing slavery within a system designed to punish such resistance. "You cannot take responsibility for the cruelty of the system you opposed," counseled Maria Weston Chapman, one of the society's leaders. "Your father's actions reveal the true nature of slavery, its reliance on family separation as a means of control and punishment." "But if I hadn't involved Bessie—" "You didn't involve her," Chapman interrupted gently. "She was already involved by virtue of her bondage. Every enslaved person lives within a web of impossible choices and limited agency. Bessie made her choice to help just as you made yours." The society members helped Sarah draft letters to anti-slavery contacts in Alabama, asking them to try to locate Bessie and monitor her situation. It was a small action, unlikely to lead to immediate results, but it represented a commitment to not abandoning those still trapped within the system. As summer turned to fall, Sarah found herself increasingly involved in the practical work of the Underground Railroad. Her role was modest at first, preparing food for fugitives passing through Boston, sewing clothes for those who arrived with nothing but the garments on their backs, writing letters to potential donors. In October, she had her first opportunity to directly assist a family who had escaped from Virginia, a mother, father, and 2 small children who needed temporary housing while arrangements were made for their journey to Canada. Sarah volunteered to host them in her room at Mrs. Harrington's boarding house, a risk given her landlady's lukewarm stance on abolition. When Mrs. Harrington discovered the fugitives, her response surprised Sarah. Instead of outrage, she exhibited a reluctant compassion, particularly for the children. "I don't approve of breaking the law," the older woman said stiffly, "but I suppose I can't turn away little ones in need regardless of their color." She provided extra blankets and food, though she made it clear this was to be a one-time arrangement. The family stayed for 3 days before continuing to Salem, where they would board a ship bound for Halifax. On their final evening, the father, a skilled carpenter named Joseph, who had purchased his own freedom only to have the papers destroyed by a new master, presented Sarah with a small wooden box he had crafted during their stay. "For your kindness," he said simply, placing it in her hands. The box was beautifully made, with a carved lid depicting a bird in flight, reminiscent of Isaiah's carving, though in a different style. Inside, Sarah found a folded paper with a rough map of the Eastern Virginia coastline, marked with symbols she recognized from Underground Railroad communications, safe houses, dangerous areas, patrol locations. "This might help others coming after us," Joseph explained. "Knowledge is precious when you're running for freedom." That night, after the family had departed with their guide, Sarah carefully studied the map by candlelight. This tangible piece of the Underground Railroad's invisible geography represented something profound, the accumulated wisdom of those who had risked everything for liberty, passed along to help others make the same journey. She placed the map in Joseph's box, alongside Isaiah's carved bird. Together, they formed a kind of personal archive, physical reminders of individual courage in the face of systemic oppression. Sarah vowed to continue adding to this collection, to preserve these stories and artifacts for a future time when slavery would exist only as a historical memory. As winter descended on Boston, bringing icy winds and snow-covered streets, Sarah received another letter from Dr. Trent. This one contained unexpected news. Isaiah and Rachel had successfully reached Canada, where they had settled in a community of former slaves near Toronto. Isaiah had found work as a carpenter's assistant, his wood-carving skills proving valuable in his new life. More remarkably, Isaiah had sent a message back through the Underground Railroad network. He wanted Sarah to know that he was building a new life in freedom, that her risk had not been in vain. Enclosed with the letter was a small newspaper clipping from the Voice of the Fugitive, a Canadian anti-slavery newspaper which mentioned IJ, among recent arrivals who had found liberty under British protection. Sarah traced the initials with her finger, tears blurring her vision. Isaiah Johnson, no longer property to be bought and sold, but a free man building a future based on his own talents and choices. It made all the hardships of her new life, the modest accommodations, the occasional hostility from pro-Southern Bostonians, the estrangement from her family, seem insignificant by comparison. That spring, Sarah took a significant step in her abolitionist work. With encouragement from Wendell Phillips, she wrote an account of her experiences growing up on a Georgia plantation, her evolving moral awakening, and her decision to help Isaiah and Rachel escape. The narrative, published as a pamphlet titled "A Daughter of the South Speaks Out Against Slavery," provided a first-hand account that countered romanticized defenses of the peculiar institution. Dessous. The publication brought both positive and negative attention. Anti-slavery societies throughout the North requested copies for distribution, and Sarah received invitations to speak at various forums. Conversely, several Boston newspapers with commercial ties to the South criticized her betrayal of her class and upbringing, questioning her motives and even her sanity. More concerning were the anonymous threats that began to arrive at Mrs. Harrington's boarding house, letters promising retribution for her treachery against the South. While most were likely empty intimidation, they served as reminders of the real dangers faced by those who publicly opposed slavery, especially former Southerners seen as traitors to their region. Despite these challenges, Sarah found her voice growing stronger as she spoke to church groups, women's societies, and anti-slavery meetings across Massachusetts. She learned to counter common pro-slavery arguments with both moral appeals and practical evidence, drawing on her first-hand knowledge of plantation economics and social structures. In one memorable exchange at a Concord lyceum, Sarah responded to a merchant's claim that slaves were treated well because they represented valuable property. "Would you accept being property yourself, sir, no matter how well treated?" she asked. "Would you accept having your children sold away from you, being denied education, having no legal right to the fruits of your labor? The gilded cage is still a cage, and human dignity requires freedom, not merely adequate food and shelter." As her public profile grew, Sarah received an unexpected letter from her brother James. Unlike her father's total rejection, James expressed a confused mixture of disapproval and grudging respect for her conviction, if not her cause. "Father has forbidden your name to be spoken at Oak Haven," he wrote. "Mother weeps when she passes your empty room. I cannot condone what you did, Sarah, but I cannot hate you for following what you believe to be right, however mistaken. We are still blood, whatever else has changed." The letter offered no reconciliation, but left a door slightly ajar, an acknowledgement of family ties that transcended political division. Sarah treasured this small connection to her past, even as she became more firmly rooted in her new northern identity. In the summer of 1857, news of the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision sent shockwaves through Boston's abolitionist community. The ruling that no black person, free or enslaved, could claim U.S. citizenship, and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in federal territories, represented a devastating setback for the anti-slavery cause. At an emergency meeting of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, Sarah watched Garrison burn a copy of the Constitution, declaring it a covenant with death and an agreement with hell for its protection of slavery. The symbolic act highlighted the growing radicalization of some abolitionists, who now saw the entire American legal system as irredeemably corrupted by compromise with slaveholders. For Sarah, the decision underscored the enormous challenge facing the abolition movement. It was no longer enough to assist individual fugitives or publish moral appeals. The entire legal and political foundation of slavery needed to be confronted and overturned. But how could this be accomplished within a system that had just dramatically reaffirmed slavery's constitutional protection? That question haunted Boston's anti-slavery circles through 1857 and into 1858, as tensions between North and South continued to escalate. The violence in Bleeding, Kansas, where pro- and anti-slavery settlers fought over the territory's future status, seemed to presage a larger conflict that many now saw as inevitable. In this climate of growing crisis, Sarah received a letter from Dr. Trent that would once again alter the course of her life. Isaiah Johnson had returned to the United States, the doctor wrote, working with the Underground Railroad in upstate New York. He sought to reconnect with Sarah, to thank her in person for her role in his journey to freedom. After careful consideration and consultation with trusted colleagues in the movement, Sarah arranged to meet Isaiah in Rochester, New York, home to the renowned abolitionist Frederick Douglass and a key station on the Underground Railroad. The journey would not be without risk. As a known abolitionist author, Sarah was increasingly recognized in public, sometimes facing hostility from pro-Southern elements. The meeting took place at the home of Amy and Isaac Post, Quaker abolitionists who had worked with Douglass and Harriet Tubman. When Isaiah walked into the Post's parlor, standing straight and tall, dressed in a well-made suit rather than the rough clothing of a field hand, Sarah felt a surge of emotion she hadn't anticipated. "Miss Sarah," he said, extending his hand in the manner of free people greeting as equals. "Or should I say, Miss Whittaker?" "Just Sarah now," she replied, taking his hand. "I've left Miss Whittaker behind in Georgia." They spent hours in conversation, filling in the gaps in each other's stories since that night by Willow Creek. Isaiah described his journey north with Rachel, the challenges of establishing himself in Canada, and his eventual decision to return to the United States to help others escape. "Freedom isn't just about reaching safety yourself," he explained. It's about extending that safety to others still in bondage. Sarah shared her experiences in Boston, the initial adjustment, finding her voice as a speaker and writer, the gradual building of a new identity within the abolition movement. She showed him the wooden bird he had given her, which she still kept as a talisman. "You've kept it all this time," Isaiah said, clearly moved by the gesture. "It reminds me of why I made the choice I did," Sarah replied, "of the humanity that the slave system tries to crush but never quite succeeds in destroying." Isaiah nodded, understanding perfectly what she meant. "I've continued carving," he said. "Sold some pieces in Toronto. Even had an exhibition at a small gallery. Freedom means creating on my own terms, not just in stolen moments between field work." As their conversation continued, they discovered a shared vision for what might come after abolition. A society where former slaves would have full citizenship rights, access to education, and economic opportunities. It was a radical vision in 1858, when even many Northern abolitionists hesitated to advocate complete social equality between the races. "I've been thinking about establishing a school," Isaiah said, "for fugitives who reached the North without basic literacy. Education was denied us precisely because knowledge is power, power to claim our full humanity." "That's a remarkable ambition," Sarah said, genuinely impressed. "I had good teachers," Isaiah replied with a small smile. "My father, who taught me to read despite the risks, and you, who taught me that not all white Southerners are blind to injustice." Before they parted, Isaiah asked if Sarah would consider collaborating on an educational project, developing materials specifically designed for adults learning to read and write after escaping slavery. Her experience as a writer could complement his first-hand understanding of the challenges facing newly freed people. "We could create something meaningful together," he suggested. "Something that looks toward the future we're fighting for, not just against the system we oppose." Sarah agreed without hesitation. The project represented exactly the kind of constructive work she had been seeking. Not just tearing down the edifice of slavery, but building something better in its place. They corresponded regularly over the following months, exchanging ideas for their educational materials and updates on their respective work in the abolition movement. Their letters, necessarily circumspect given the risks of interception, nonetheless developed a depth and openness that surprised them both. In early 1859, Sarah made a decision that scandalized Boston society, but felt increasingly inevitable to her. She moved to Rochester to work more directly with Isaiah on their educational project, taking lodgings with the Post family, who had become trusted allies in the movement. The collaboration flourished, resulting in a series of readers specifically designed for adult learners, with content that affirmed their dignity and addressed practical concerns of life in freedom. The materials were distributed through anti-slavery networks to communities of fugitives and free black people throughout the northern states and Canada. Sarah and Isaiah's working relationship gradually evolved into something deeper, a connection based on shared values, mutual respect, and genuine affection that transcended the social boundaries of race and background. In a society that violently rejected such relationships, they moved carefully, their feelings expressed mostly through their joint work and in private conversations within the safety of abolitionist circles. "We're building a small corner of the world as it should be," Isaiah observed one evening as they finished a teaching session with a group of recently arrived fugitives. "Not waiting for society to change, but creating that change ourselves." "It's not enough," Sarah replied, thinking of the millions still in bondage across the South. "But it's something real, something that can't be taken away." In October 1859, news of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry electrified the nation. Brown's attempt to initiate a slave rebellion by seizing the federal arsenal represented a dramatic escalation from moral suasion to armed resistance. His capture, trial, and execution became a pivotal moment in the growing national crisis over slavery. For Sarah and Isaiah, Brown's raid prompted soul-searching about the limits of peaceful resistance in the face of entrenched injustice. While neither endorsed violence as a first resort, Brown's willingness to die for the cause of abolition forced them to confront difficult questions about what might be required to end the slave system. Moral arguments alone haven't brought freedom to a single slave, Isaiah pointed out during one intense discussion. It's direct action, the Underground Railroad, resistance, and yes, sometimes force, that has made any real difference. But violence invites counter-violence, Sarah countered. If abolition comes through bloodshed, what kind of society will emerge from that blood? They had no easy answers, only a growing sense that events were accelerating toward a reckoning that would transform the nation, for better or worse. As 1860 dawned, with the presidential campaign highlighting the deepening sectional crisis, Sarah received unexpected news from Georgia. Her father had died suddenly of a stroke, leaving Oak Haven to James. The letter from Dr. Trent, rather than her family, included a poignant detail. Thomas Whitaker had kept a small portrait of Sarah in his desk drawer, suggesting that despite his public disowning of his daughter, he had never fully severed the emotional bond between them. The news reopened wounds Sarah had thought long healed. She had built a new life based on rejecting her father's values and the system he represented. Yet learning of his death brought a complex grief for the relationship that had been lost, for the reconciliation that would never come, for the man who, despite his moral blindness regarding slavery, had loved her in his way. Isaiah supported her through this difficult period, offering a perspective shaped by his own complex experience of family separation under slavery. Grief doesn't have to make sense, he told her. You can mourn the father you lost while still rejecting the slaveholder he was. As the sectional crisis deepened following Lincoln's election in November 1860, Sarah and Isaiah intensified their work, sensing that momentous changes were approaching. When Southern states began to secede after Lincoln's victory, they recognized that the conflict they had long anticipated was finally arriving. The bombardment of Fort Sumter in April 1861 marked the beginning of the Civil War, transforming the landscape of American politics and the abolition movement virtually overnight. What had been a moral crusade by a dedicated minority now became intertwined with a national struggle for union. For Sarah and Isaiah, the war represented both opportunity and challenge. While the conflict opened new possibilities for emancipation, it also brought increased danger for their educational work and personal relationship, as war fever heightened racial tensions even in northern cities. In Rochester, they expanded their program to accommodate the growing number of contraband slaves who escaped to Union lines as federal forces advanced into Confederate territory. These newly freed people, many completely illiterate after lifetimes in bondage, arrived in northern cities with little beyond their desire for education and self-improvement. Sarah's experiences during this period formed the basis for her most significant written work, From Bondage to Freedom. Education as Liberation, published in 1863, shortly after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The book combined practical educational methodology with a philosophical vision of education as essential to full citizenship for formerly enslaved people. The publication brought renewed attention to Sarah and Isaiah's work, including funding from freedmen's aid societies and philanthropic organizations. It also attracted scrutiny from those who opposed their collaborative approach and the implicit challenge it represented to racial hierarchies. In the spring of 1864, as the war entered its final bloody phase, Sarah received another letter from Georgia. James, now the master of Oak Haven, wrote that the plantation had suffered under the Union blockade and the general economic collapse of the Confederacy. More significantly, he had begun to question the moral foundations of the society he had been raised to defend. Watching men die for the right to own other men has clarified certain matters for me, he wrote. I cannot say I have reached your position entirely, but I no longer condemn you for following your conscience where it led. James also included news that would prove life-changing. Bessie and her daughter Lily had been located in Alabama. With the collapse of Confederate authority in areas under Union control, many slaves were leaving plantations and seeking to reunite with family members separated by sale. James offered to help bring them north if Sarah wished to assist in their resettlement. For Isaiah, the possibility of helping Bessie and Lily, who had played roles in his own escape, represented a completion of the circle that had begun that night by Willow Creek. For Sarah, it offered a chance to address one of the deepest regrets of her abolitionist journey, that her actions had contributed to Bessie's punishment and separation from her daughter. As Union forces advanced through Georgia and Alabama in late 1864, making Sherman's march to the sea and effectively breaking the back of Confederate resistance, the opportunity to bring Bessie and Lily north finally materialized. James, in a remarkable transformation from his earlier position, helped arrange their transport to Union lines, from where they traveled to Rochester with the assistance of Freedmen's Aid Societies. The reunion in January 1865 was emotional for all involved. Bessie, now in her 40s, but appearing much older after years of hardship in Alabama, embraced Sarah with tears streaming down her face. "Miss Sarah," she said, the old form of address coming automatically despite their changed circumstances, "I never thought to see you again in this world." "Just Sarah now," Sarah corrected gently. "We meet as free women, equal before the law." Lily, no longer the small girl who had loved Isaiah's carved birds, but a young woman of 16, regarded Sarah and Isaiah with cautious curiosity. She had few memories of Oak Haven or of the events that had set all their lives on new courses, but she had grown up with her mother's stories of the master's daughter who had defied her family to help fugitives escape. In the weeks that followed, Sarah and Isaiah helped Bessie and Lily settle into Rochester's free black community. Lily, bright and eager to learn despite her lack of formal education, joined their adult literacy program, while Bessie found work as a cook in a local hotel. As the Civil War ground toward its conclusion, with Union victory increasingly certain, discussions about the post-war future of freed slaves intensified. The question was no longer whether emancipation would come, but what form it would take, and what rights and opportunities would be extended to those emerging from bondage. Sarah and Isaiah found themselves at the center of these discussions within Rochester's reform circles, advocating for comprehensive education, land distribution to former slaves, and full political rights, including the vote. Their vision, radical by the standards of 1865, envisioned a multiracial democracy in which the barriers of caste and color would gradually dissolve through equal citizenship and economic opportunity. Lincoln's assassination in April 1865 cast a shadow over the Union victory and raised new concerns about the future of Reconstruction. Would his successor, Andrew Johnson, show the same commitment to securing the freedom and rights of former slaves? Early signs were not encouraging, as Johnson's lenient approach to former Confederates and resistance to strong federal protection for freed people suggested a retreat from Lincoln's evolving position. In this uncertain climate, Sarah and Isaiah made a decision that would have been unthinkable when they first met at Oak Haven nearly a decade earlier. They would marry, making a public commitment to each other and to their shared vision of a society where race no longer determined one's place or possibilities. The ceremony took place in June 1865, performed by Frederick Douglass in his home on South Avenue in Rochester. It was a small gathering of their closest allies in the abolition movement, including Bessie and Lily, Dr. Trent, who had relocated to Philadelphia after the war, and a few trusted colleagues from their educational work. Their marriage, though legal in New York State, represented a profound challenge to American racial conventions, even in the relatively progressive North. They received threats and hate mail, lost some financial supporters for their educational program, and occasionally faced hostility on Rochester's streets. Yet they also found strength in their commitment to living according to their deepest values, regardless of social pressure. Their home became a gathering place for reformers of all races, a model of the integrated society they hoped would gradually emerge from the ashes of the slave system and the Civil War. In the fall of 1865, Sarah received a letter from James that would complete her long journey from Oak Haven. Her brother, continuing his remarkable evolution from defender of the Southern way of life to cautious reformer, had decided to sell the plantation. The institution of slavery was dead, and with it the economic model that had supported the grand estates of the antebellum South. More significantly, James planned to donate a portion of the proceeds from the sale to Sarah and Isaiah's educational foundation, specifically to establish a school for former slaves in Georgia. The proposed school would be built on land that had once been part of Oak Haven, a symbolic transformation of space once dedicated to exploitation into a center for liberation through learning. "It seems fitting," James wrote, "that something positive should emerge from our family's complicity in a system we now recognize as wrong. I cannot undo the past, but perhaps I can help build a better future." The letter represented closure of a kind, not an erasure of the past with its moral complexities and painful divisions, but a recognition that redemption was possible through constructive action in the present. The family that had once owned human beings as property would now contribute to their educational empowerment. As 1865 drew to a close, with slavery abolished throughout the United States by the 13th Amendment, Sarah and Isaiah Johnson stood on the threshold of a new era. The great moral struggle against slavery that had defined their lives and brought them together had been won, but the equally challenging work of building a truly just and equal society was just beginning. They faced this future together, their unlikely partnership a testament to the possibility of transcending the boundaries of race and background through shared moral commitment. The carved wooden bird that had once symbolized Isaiah's quest for freedom now represented something more, the freedom they had both found in following their deepest convictions, regardless of the cost. In her journal on New Year's Eve 1865, Sarah wrote words that summed up her extraordinary journey from plantation mistress to abolitionist activist and educator. "We cannot know what the coming years will bring, what new struggles and challenges await as our nation attempts to rebuild itself on more just foundations. But this much I do know. When one acts from true moral conviction, the path may be difficult, but it is never wrong. Isaiah and I have found freedom together, not just freedom from the chains of slavery and prejudice, but freedom to become our best selves in service to a cause greater than either of us. And in that freedom, we have discovered a happiness I could never have imagined on that night by Willow Creek when our paths first crossed." The wooden bird watched over these words from its place of honor on her desk, a simple carving that had traveled from the slave quarters of Oak Haven to Rochester, New York, bearing witness to a transformation as profound as the nation's own journey from slavery to freedom.